It was an inflection point that with Putin's new term, there was going to be possibly some considerations about personnel shuffles. But I think that the change at this moment in time was something of a surprise because there have been many periods where the frontline situation was a lot worse for Russia than it was now. Russia is trying unevenly to advance in Donetsk, advance in Kharkiv, but it's suffered many humiliating defeats, like in late 2022.
The Kremlin has announced that Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to replace his long-standing ally and defence minister, Sergei Shoigu. He's been in post since 2012 and has played a key role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This weekend, Russian forces stepped up their offensive into the Kharkiv region, attempting to take ground from Ukraine before the delayed US aid arrives and force a depleted Ukrainian army into diverting resources away from Donetsk. Well, let's speak to Dr. Samuel Ramani, who is Associate Professor of Defence and Geopolitics at the think tank RUSI and the author of Putin's War on Ukraine. Samuel, hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for being with us. Give me your reaction to the Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, leaving post.
Well, obviously it was an inflection point that with Putin's new term, there was going to be possibly some considerations about personnel shuffles. But I think that the change at this moment in time was something of a surprise because there have been many periods where the frontline situation was a lot worse for Russia than it was now. Russia is trying unevenly to advance in Donetsk, advance in Kharkiv, but it's suffered many humiliating defeats, like in late 2022. And I think that the dismissal is probably linked to the desire to integrate economic and defense policy more closely. So as Russia creates a war economy, it wants to have somebody from the Ministry of Economic Development be involved in running defense, and that's why Andrei Belousov has been appointed, and also the economic practitioners who've been fighting the Western sanctions have been much more effective than the military so far. So maybe that efficacy they're hoping can be translated to the war effort.
Right, okay. And what does that tell us about the effectiveness of that war effort?
Well, obviously, Shoigu is not completely gone. He's going to be still the Secretary of the National Security Council, which is quite an influential role because Nikolai Patrushev, who also was removed, was occupying that role before, and that was one of the key roles that drove Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place, and it's one of the few roles that really actively consults Putin on policy there. So Shoigu is still playing a role in the war effort. He's still playing a role in military technical cooperation in his new role, which is what he did when he brought North Korean artillery shells into Russia, and also greater cooperation with Iran. And the chief commander of the armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, is staying in place, despite speculation recently that Sergei Shoigu, his ousted predecessor, would return. So I think that in general, I think Putin is not making sweeping changes to the war effort, but is merely trying to link economic policy and the war economy more fully and bring in some fresh ideas from the economic ministries into the war effort.
All right, that's very interesting. Take us through what's happened then, particularly in eastern Ukraine, in the Kharkiv region, since Friday, Samuel.
Well, basically what's happened is that the Russians have launched a significant offensive inside Kharkiv. This is not something that was wholly unexpected because the Russians have been signaling that they want to recapture the territories they lost, including Izium and Kupiansk, which are key railway hubs in late 2022. They got Bakhmut, and now they're closing in on Chasiv Yar, so they, in theory, could get a logistics triangle or parallelogram if they can get those all those areas back. So this is something that the Russians have been wanting to do for close to 18 months now to recapture this, and the Ukrainians began evacuating civilians from this area in January of 2023. So this is not a surprise, but I think the timing of it is partially aimed at diverting Ukrainian forces' attention away from Donetsk. They've struggled to make meaningful progress in Chasiv Yar, according to the latest British intelligence reports, and now they want to hope that if they can divert some Ukrainian personnel away, they might be able to create a distraction that allows them to win there and advance on larger cities in the east. So I don't think this is aimed at taking over Kharkiv, but it's largely aimed at facilitating greater gains in Donetsk.
Right, okay. And one of the reasons that Ukraine find themselves potentially a bit stretched in Donetsk and actually perhaps vulnerable to an offensive like this is because of, so says the mayor of Kharkiv, delays in aid from Western countries, namely the US. Is that a fair assessment, or the sort of thing you would expect them to say as they continue to put pressure on Western countries to supply aid?
Well, delayed aid is certainly a major cause for the failures here. Kharkiv obviously was chronically much less defended than Odessa is, which is a key port city for grain exports, and definitely much less defended than the largest city in Ukraine, Kiev. So, with limited air defense supplies, with limited artillery shells to go around, and the front line in Donbass, as well as the need to protect those two other major cities that I just mentioned, Kharkiv has been left vulnerable. So it's true that there is an issue of aid, but also Russia's mobilization has kicked in in large scale. They've managed to replenish their supply chains through imports from North Korea and Iran, as well as through their own domestic productions of drones and equipment on a large scale. They've also managed to neutralize and weaken the efficacy of some effective NATO-backed systems like the HIMARS are now being jammed more often. So there's been some Russian tactical improvements, greater Russian mobilization. That's also a reason why the Ukrainians are struggling in Kharkiv. So aid is probably a significant factor, but we shouldn't ignore some of the adjustments that Russia's made. Russia's learned from the catastrophic first 3 to 6 months of this war.
Right. Gains, I mean, they've been few and far between, really. The Ukraine claiming they've done quite a good job of pushing back, particularly in some of those villages around Kharkiv region. Do you think, though, that Russia will sit back this Sunday night and feel it's been a successful weekend?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether this is very much of a success. I mean, the Russians have claimed success in 5 relatively small populated villages. The Ukrainians have dismissed that, claiming that the Kharkiv area is contained. The offensive there is contained. The Ukrainians, however, also admitted, though, in some of their previous statements, including from Sirski's office, that the situation in Kharkiv is quite difficult and that there's a lot of developments that are happening in Chasiv and Liman and other areas. So the statements are so mixed, it's really hard to tell whether the Russians will be looking at this positively or negatively. But given the struggles in terms of urban warfare that we've seen, in terms of even taking over basically depopulated towns like Bakhmut, obviously the Russians know that any campaign in Kharkiv is going to be immense and very costly, and they weren't expecting really anything other than a few marginal gains at best in a weekend offensive.
Okay. Samuel, nice to have your company tonight. Thank you very much for your insight, Dr. Samuel Ramani, who is the author of Putin's War on Ukraine.